So to begin this video, I'm going to let you in on a spy philosophy that I've always had for the 8 years that I've been playing this game. There are no bad disguises. Every disguise's strengths and weaknesses are just so vastly different from every other's that I really don't think it is possible to quantify one as worse than any other. In researching this video, I desperately tried to categorize all of the spy disguises in various tier lists of rankings of different criteria, and I simply just couldn't. There was far too much to consider for every single disguise. So instead for this video, I'm going to be going through all of Spy's disguises and telling you whether I recommended them as a generalist disguise or a specialist disguise. Please bear in mind that this list is from the perspective of a casual Spy player. Casual players are not necessarily worse than competitive players, and that will not be a contributing factor in my list. I just simply have more experience in the casual environment, therefore I'm not adequate to make a list on Spy disguises in competitive environments. Now, with the intro finally being wrapped up, would you please consider subscribing if you're enjoying this video so far and you'd like to see like-minded content in the future. And with that all being said, why don't we start by covering the most problematic disguise on this list. Okay, yeah, so I'm fairly confident in calling the Scout's disguise Spy's most problematic disguise. But before I do that, allow me to explain the difference between generalist and specialist disguises. So a generalist disguise is a disguise of a class that can fill multiple roles within a team. They're not specifically doing one thing or another consistently, they can perform a multitude of roles depending on what the team needs. Now, a specialist disguise on the other hand is the complete opposite. It is a disguise of a class that is designed to do one thing and one thing only. And therefore, whilst using a specialist disguise, you must get into the mindset of that class, and you must act the way they would normally be doing whilst performing their specific functions. Now, with all of this being said, I believe Scout is Spy's most problematic disguise because he splits fairly down the middle between a generalist and a specialist disguise. You see, a Scout can naturally provide a little bit of all. He can capture objectives, he can manage the flanks, he can even provide a bit of support. And therefore you'd think this generalist mindset would apply over to the Spy disguise as well, but it just simply doesn't. Or not all of it does, anyway. With the disguise, you still get to keep the promises of the positioning that the class can naturally have, but because of your slower than Scout's movement speed, you're actually fairly limited in where you can get to and therefore what you can be pretending to do. And speaking of that slower movement speed, we all know by now that when you disguise as a Scout, you do not gain the movement speed that you are missing. However, one of the main tips that people will give you to disguise this is to consistently strafe back and forth and continuously jump. Yet this greatly hinders your movement and therefore this greatly hinders your positioning at most times. But at the same time, I also have to admit that this strafing technique is incredibly good at fooling players to walk towards you. So all of this, may it be a bit confusing, is just to say that Scout can perform a bit of a specialist and a generalist disguise role, and therefore I now have to pick which one I recommend him as. Well, with all of this being considered for, I'm actually going to recommend him as a specialist disguise. Most people default to disguising as Scout, and I heavily recommend against this because you are insanely obvious to spot because of your movement speed. But Scout disguises work incredibly well in very specific scenarios which involve baiting the enemy to walk towards you. This to me is a specialist role. I don't know, you can feel free to disagree with me on this one in the comments. Like I said, this is the most problematic disguise we'll be covering. Everyone from here on out should be a pretty straight answer. But I just feel because you don't have the movement speed, you are greatly limited in what you can be pretending to do, and therefore I actually consider this a specialist disguise. Okay, we're finally done with Scout, so let's move on to Soldier. So Soldier disguises generally have the worst of all traits I could really think of in giving a disguise. Because yes, the Soldier himself has a class-specific mechanic that is fantastic for positioning, but obviously the Spy does not get that. Top that off with the second worst movement speed in the entire game and we have what looks like a fairly unpromising disguise. However, I'm going to say this first and then explain my answer because I actually do recommend Soldier disguises as generalist disguises. So as mentioned earlier, the Soldier naturally has fantastic positioning. Therefore, if you are disguised as a Soldier, you are never really out of place. He could be at the very back lines, maybe he's rocket jumped away to go get a health pack. He can be at the very front lines. He can be up with the medic duo, he can maybe be part of the medic duo. And these are all incredibly desirable traits for a Spy disguise. Maybe I'd recommend Soldier disguises specifically on smaller maps where the walking speed penalty isn't too much of a problem, but in turn allow me to also recommend Soldier disguises on maps with great verticality, because if you see an engineer walking above you, that's probably going to be quite suspicious, but if you see a soldier walking above you, well, you probably just assumed he's rocket jumped up there. and getting you to assume that the disguise is in the right place at the right time is exactly what a spy needs to succeed. I love Pyro disguises. Pyro disguises are so versatile that they fit into pretty much every scenario at all times. Because of Pyro's weird status of a pick, power and support class all at the same time, his versatility is unmatched amongst the tier 2 mercs when it comes to everything from positioning, to what roles he should fulfill on the team, to his incredibly unique supporting capabilities. And therefore all of this makes him an absolutely fantastic generalist disguise. Pyro disguises are the ones I default to using the most, especially when there's a free to play Pyro on the enemy team. Yes, I know earlier on I said I wouldn't be factoring in that casual players are casual players, but whenever there is a free-to-play Pyro on the enemy team, always disguises him and you will get work done, I promise. Yeah, I really don't have anything else to add with Pyro disguises. They're just great generalist disguises. And I guess, in a way, this just proves how much I had to say about Scout, as that will probably be the longest section throughout this entire video. Demoman disguises are absolutely fantastic when you are along the enemy's front lines, because being a big bulky power class, that's where the Demoman is naturally located, and because of that he is naturally surrounded by support classes all the time, and these support classes are your main targets as a spy. Now it is actually fairly easy to be out of place as a Demoman, more so than you'd think actually. Because Demomen are generally very front line and centered classes, it's quite rare to see them behind your backlines or even flanking up on the enemy. So because of this, the area to which a Demoman disguise is effective is actually relatively small, but within that area he is very effective. Now I am going to quickly talk about Demo Knight for a bit, as Demo Knight throws a complete and utter curveball into this. Simply put, if I consider Demoman to be a specialist disguise, I consider Demo Knight to be a generalist disguise, and a very good one at that. You do need to watch out for what kind of sword he is using. If he is using the Eyelander, remember you will not gain the speed boost and you will not gain the glowing eye, so I often don't recommend disguising as Demo Knights using the Eyelander, well, which tends to be all of them if I'm honest. But if he is using any other sword apart from the Scotsman Skullcutter because you do not gain the speed penalty, then I think disguising as a Demo Knight is a fantastic idea. Now with that being said, you do need to be cautious of the various bugs that can happen whilst disguised as a Demo Knight. I mean, look at this clip down here. Whilst recording this video, I managed to get my melee to be the Sandman and my secondary to be the Mad Milk, and can I just say, Demoman holding the Sandman is the most natural thing I've ever seen in Tier 2. Looks a bit like the Cat in the Hat meme. But getting back on topic, I do generally consider the Demoman disguise to be more specialist and the Demo Knight disguise to be more generalist, but if I had to even them out, I would put the Demoman as a whole in the generalist category. The disguise you pick can be very flexible depending on what weapons he's using, and therefore I consider this to be quite a good generalist disguise. But once again, watch your positioning, watch your weapons, and make sure you're not holding something random, because that happens quite a lot whenever the boots are nearby. Now, I am actually a defender of heavy disguises. Heavy disguises are not useless and they are not the worst disguise. Remember, there is no worst disguise. They just function in very specific scenarios, of which don't often come up, but they do function in those scenarios. Just like with Scout's disguises, heavy disguises are fantastic at baiting the enemy to come towards you. Your greatest strength with a heavy disguise is that no one would ever suspect you would ever disguise as a heavy ever, because why would you? And this is what makes heavy disguises really strong. Spy's whole strength is making people believe that he is not an enemy, and therefore heavy disguises do this better than honestly any other class. It's all about public perception. Everyone thinks the heavy disguise is terrible, and therefore no one bothers to spy check the heavy, and this is your time to strike. Getting back to the bait thing, heavy disguises function best just like how Scout disguises function best, swaying backwards and forwards just outside of the objective and getting players to come towards you in an effort to rally the team. Maybe baiting of spy disguises deserves its own video, I'm not really too sure at this point, but I'm going to be mentioning this a lot in this video. And once again, because no one would ever believe you would disguise as a heavy, everyone sees that heavy calling for help, naturally assumes he wants you to follow him, and then when you start to follow him, they find out rather quickly that you are a spy and that they are dead. So give the heavy disguise a go. It only works in very specific scenarios, and therefore I consider it a rather specialist disguise, if not the most specialist disguise. But you really have to play like a heavy when disguising as one, which might sound obvious, but it's actually more difficult than you might think. Engineer is a very popular disguise for Spy, and I actually take a lot of issue with this. I think a good, effective Engineer disguise takes a lot of setting up to execute properly, and a lot of setting up that you're probably not going to get in your average match. The main issue I have with Engineer disguises as a whole is that Engineers are very communicative. If an Engineer dies to a Spy, he will let his team know that he has died to a Spy, and he will ask another Engineer to remove the Sapper. I generally find that Engineers are the most communicative of the mercs when it comes to using the text or voice chat, more so than medics in fact. But then again, this video does apply to a casual setting. I'm sure this is very different in a competitive setting. And as you probably know by now, communication is the death of a good spy. So let's take a specialist scenario from now on, where we're going to assume there is only one Engineer on the enemy team. So yes, like I was saying, Engineer disguises take a lot of setup to work properly. You need to be playing around the Engineer's buildings and the rest of his team along the back lines, because an Engineer along the front lines is very obviously a spy. Engineers do not push payloads, and if there is an Engineer approaching the payload, you should always spy check him. That being said, the specific scenarios in which Engineer disguises do work are actually rather cool. So if I want to take out a sentry nest, I will often not sap the buildings. I will probably use something like the Eurotunnel Reward, and I will just pick off the Engineer and hang around for a bit for another victim to come along and pick off him as well. This to me is the prime example of when to disguise as an Engineer, when you are lurking around the buildings and when he is dead, and therefore you can use the buildings to bait other players to come towards them, say like for example with a teleporter or a dispenser, and then you can pick them off there. I do not recommend Engineer in the slightest as a Generalist disguise. He's not a bad disguise in the slightest, he just takes a lot of setup to not look out of place, because Engineers as a whole are a very stationary class and Spies are not. Okay, I have quite a bit to say about medic disguises, and I'm going to start it all off by saying that this is the most risky disguise a spy could choose. Simply put, when players see a medic, they tend to drop their guard and run towards them. This can be seen as quite a good thing, as a spy you want people to be near you and you want them to drop their guard. However, you don't necessarily want them to be facing you. And if you run up to a medic and he doesn't immediately start healing you, you are going to suspect something is wrong very quickly. I often find that whilst disguised as medic, I get bumped a lot, and this has something to do with players just naturally wanting to be closer to you. Top this all off with the fact that medics only really belong on the front lines or maybe on the back lines if they're retreating to go get health packs, and you have a disguise that only really functions in very specific scenarios and has a lot of risks tied to that. But with this being said, the upsides come in the form of bait, because as I said earlier, players will naturally drop their guard around a medic. So you can use this to bait players round corners and go for stabs, or you can use this to bait players to run into enemy fire. This is something I've done a couple times over and it's actually really funny. So I recommend medic as a specialist disguise, however I advise utter caution when doing so. In reality, medic is probably the disguise I would recommend the least, and from talking to a couple other spy YouTubers in the making of this video, I know that's something they don't really agree with. However, it's just not something I can personally get to work for me, but maybe I need more experience. So there are two types of sniper disguise users, those who are convinced it is the best disguise for every situation and swear by it, and those who are just running the ambassador and are trying to get close enough to the enemy snipers using the Razorback so they can headshot them. Now the first group of people are incredibly stubborn and are utterly convinced that they will not change their ways in any shape or form. Sniper disguises to them are the best for every scenario. However, these people are just wrong, and that's not an opinion because it applies to everybody because they are just wrong. Sniper disguises are fantastic at taking out engineers and snipers specifically because they work best when you are along the enemy's back lines. This is where these classes tend to linger. So no, sniper disguises are not an instant throw on and win kind of disguise, but they are a massive war pig and one that people greatly overestimate the use of. Use them sparingly, change up your loadouts, do all sorts of things like that, just don't default to the... Okay, yeah, look, okay, this is the best soundsmith I can do, right? I'm a British lad. Okay, and he's a Texan who does not sound like a Texan. It is not an easy voice to do. I mean, yeah, I could do some of the inflections, but that's about it. Okay, I had another section written for this bit where I was going to use Byleth to demonstrate what a sniper can do, but let's move on to Spy. I'm tired. Let's move on to Spy. And finally, we bring ourselves to talk about spy disguises, which sounds kind of funny because we've technically been talking about spy disguises throughout this entire video. So disguising as the spy does have its perks, the main two being masking respawn outlines and your independency. So as you probably know by now, when you respawn, your entire team is outlined to you, and this includes enemy spies who are disguised as a member of your team. So whenever I'm moving from point A to point B and there is someone respawning on the enemy team, I tend to throw on the spy disguise. I do this not just because you don't have a speed penalty whilst disguised, but an enemy on the enemy team would see a spy behind the enemy's back lines and think, oh, that's natural, that's where spies naturally are, and therefore that's not of concern. Whereas if you were disguised as a pyro and the enemy saw you behind the enemy lines, well, they would probably suspect you were a spy. Now with that being said, spy disguises desperately do not work when there are large groups of people. Spies do not push payloads, and their strength comes from when they are alone. So spy disguises do not work in the slightest when there are large groups of players, however they work fantastically when it comes to picking off teammates in small numbers. A spy is naturally going to be weaving his way around the flanks, and therefore you will not be out of place there. However, there is one final thing to talk about with the spy disguise that is a big problem, and that is reflex checking. So when you are disguised as a spy, some players will naturally just reflex check you because it's what they do. This can obviously be a big problem for a spy trying to stay hidden. So in a very bizarre tip, I actively do not recommend disguising as a spy once the teams have changed colours. Only disguise as a spy when the teams are on their first colours. Once they change colours and once they change positions, then some people's reflexes will be thrown off a bit, and that's detrimental to you. So I am going to put spy disguises in the generalist category because they are generally great for moving from point A to point B, and well, just generally great at moving in general. I'd be more than willing to hear anyone out who wants to argue that they are more of a specialist disguise. It's a bit like with Scout, as I'm not really too sure where to put spies. But I use the spy disguise as a generalist one, and it works for me quite well. However, reflex checking is the detriment to all good spy disguises, so make sure that you're far away from everyone and anyone. And there we are finally at the end of this video. This video went through a lot of changes during production. Like I said earlier in the video, I was originally going to be ranking all spy disguises from least to most generalist. However, I realised that's just not possible because it isn't possible to rank spy disguises by such a criteria. So if anyone makes any spy disguise rankings in the future, just be cautious, as every disguise really does have its place, and I truly believe there are no disguises worse than any others. Now before I wrap up, I have a few thank yous to give. So first of all, thank you to Demoman on Twitter for making the render for this thumbnail. You can contact him on Twitter, or you can find him through my Discord server. His commission to open, and he's a wonderful guy. And the second thank you goes to Coolstuff, who is a small spy YouTuber who helped me a ton with the research of this video. I asked a lot of larger spy YouTubers in the making of this video for various tips and pointers, and a lot of them said they were busy. However, Coolstuff got back to me next day and gave me a massive paragraph about various tips he has for various disguises. And whilst a lot of his advice was related to the original concept of the video, I was still able to apply a lot of it. So his channel is linked down below. Please go give him a like, as he helped me out a lot with the making of this video. And with that being said, that's all I have to say. Thank you very much to everyone for watching. Let me know if you'd like to see more spy content in the future, let me know if you wouldn't, and I will see you later down the sunny road.